Hi guys! In this tutorial, you'll learn all about the Topstitch tools in Marvelous Designer 7. The Topstitch tools are found up here. This one is to edit top stitches which you've made. This one is to create top stitches along segment lines. Those are straight lines between two segment points. And this one is to create freestyle top stitches anywhere you want, along curved lines, along multiple segment lines, in circles. And this tool here is to show and hide your top stitches in the 2D pattern window over here. Here are some quick ideas of where you can add stitches on your clothes, like in these examples, adding stitches on pockets for pretty effects, stitched text, stitches on cuffs and hems, on the inside of clothing, around logos, as decoration on clothing, around pockets, to make different parts stick out, around flies. So let's create a top stitch along this top line. If you want a top stitch to run along here, you have to create the top stitch on this segment line itself. So let's take the segment Topstitch tool and click once. You can see that the segment line turns pink and instantly a stitching line appears beneath it, in parallel to it. If I would click here, another line would appear parallel to this segment line. You can see that they overlap here. If you wanted to create a top stitch which ran all the way from here to here without overlapping, you would need to use the Freestyle Topstitch tool to run from here down to here. And there you can see it doesn't overlap at the connection. But let's start with just one top stitch line. So after you create a top stitch, how do you edit it? How do you change the colors, the style of the stitching? Well, there's several ways. Right after creating it, you can see we landed in the Topstitch tab in the object browser. If we click on this default Topstitch material setting, we have different options which we can edit. If we were to switch to a different tool and to do something else in our pattern and then want to edit this top stitch, all we have to do is select our Edit Topstitch tool, click on it, and it will take us back to this Topstitch tab where we can edit the settings. Alternatively, if you want a different tool, you could just go to the Topstitch tab, then click on the desired top stitch and change the settings. To start with, I recommend that you name your top stitch something which makes sense. So if this is at the bottom of pants, you might name it Pants Bottom Stitch. Or if it's a cuff, Cuff Stitch. I'm going to name this just something simple, Top Line Stitch. You can either edit the name here by clicking once and then typing in the name you want, or by clicking once here and typing in the name you want. We have several settings under the material options. To change the color, simply click on the color icon and then select any color that you want. If you make the stitch a pure white or a pure black, you can see it looks very flat. Even though it is a 3D stitch, the color greatly affects the look. If it's pure bright red, it also has no shadows, no lights, no darks around, and it looks very flat. So best to choose a color that is not super strong or super dark. Like here in the gray zone, you can see there's a bit of a shadow beneath and above it, which makes it look more three-dimensional. I'm going to leave it on white for now. If you open up this little triangle here, you can also change the ambient intensity and the diffuse intensity of the color. If you want your stitches to be closer to the edge or to the line that you applied them onto, change the offset settings. If we change it to 1, you can see it got much closer to the edge. I'm going to put it around 2. The length, this controls the length of the strings. So if we increase that, you can see they got much longer. The space controls the space between the stitches. So if I decrease that, you can see they came much closer together. Now if I increase that, they separate. Thread thickness. For that, I'm going to tilt this pattern piece a bit so we can better see what's going on there. As you can see, these stitches are like real stitches coming out of the fabric, three-dimensionally. So let's go back on that line, and back on that stitching setting. And if we increase the thread thickness, like to 0.6, you can see they stand out much more from the fabric, and they're also much thicker, like really fat slugs. Not only the thickness changes, but also the height. So if we increase it to 2, for instance, you can see they became much taller and they also became much fatter. You can also see the change here. It became much more stretched. So I'm going to put it back to something 0.4. Now let's talk about the facing options. What does that do? If you say face front, the stitches will be on the outside side of your fabric. So we turn around this fabric. We can see this is the dark side, the inner side of the fabric, inner side of the clothes. If we want the stitches to only appear on the inner side, then we can change this from front to back. And then now you see the stitches on the inside, but not on the outside, only on the inside. If you want the stitches to be on both sides, change this from back or from front to both. Now you can see we have stitches on this side, and we have stitches on that side. When would you want the stitches only on the inside? Well, if you're creating clothes, for instance, for a virtual fashion catalog, and there are no avatars in your clothing, then sometimes you might see the inner side of the fabric, such as the inside of a shirt or the inside of some trousers, and you might want to add that extra touch of realism by having some stitches on the inside, such as, for instance, a longer collar or a longer wash tag or label which only appears on the inside of the clothing. Some clothing items have a double stitch line, such as 2 lines or sometimes maybe even 3 lines, to strengthen certain parts of the clothes or for decoration along cuffs and the bottoms of seams, doubled parts. You can change the number of lines here. Currently they only allow you up to 5 lines. If I set it to 2, after a moment, you'll see a second line appears beneath the first one. This distance controls the distance between the lines. If I increase that to 3, you can see the lines separate a lot more. There's also another way to make another parallel line if you didn't want to use this feature for some reason. And that is, if this stitch was along an internal line, you could just copy and paste it. If it's along an edge line and you want to create another stitching line beneath it, you can just right click on this edge line using your edit tool and then say offset as internal line, and here control the distance. Okay, and then take the segment stitch tool, click on it, and there you have another line. Now you can move this internal line to adjust exactly where the second stitching line appears. And if for some reason you wanted to have 10 stitching lines, one beneath another, this is how you could do it. Grab this internal line, copy it, paste it, and it will copy it with the stitching, and there you have another line. You can move it up or down. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of this extra stitching line, and now let's look at some other stitching settings. There's a bar tag stitch. If we zoom in very close, you can see this stitch, oops, where are you? Is a very fine ziggity-zaggity stitch. It's a bit hard to see it at this size. Let's make it a bit longer. There, you can see it's this kind of zigzag stitch. Aside from that one, there's a buttonhole stitch, which is usually used around buttonholes, but which you can also use somewhere else in the garment if you think it's a nice kind of stitching, maybe for some kind of special beggar clothing with some kind of stitches around patches that they have on their clothes, or some other kind of rough clothing. There's also the overlock stitch, which I think is a very pretty one. And remember, if you want to change the width, you have to change the length setting. So you make that smaller, you can see it gets much narrower. And here we have a width setting, which is actually going to change the height. As you can see, it just got much shorter when we change that. If we increase the width, it changes the height. And the length changes the width. It's a little bit confusing, but just remember, width is actually height and length is width. So aside from the overlock, there's a pick stitch, which is the simple in and out stitch. Then there's a single stitch, which is like the pick stitch but much closer together, as you can see here. Single with an offset 0, which is tight along whichever line that you sewed the stitch onto, in this case the edge of this pattern, and there's a zigzag, which is like the bar tack one, but just bigger and with more space. Here too, the stitch width, as you can see, controls the height, and the length controls the width. If you like a particular setting that you made with the width, the offset, the length, the thickness, colors, and settings, you can save it here as a preset, which you can later load in by clicking an open button and loading it in. Now let's take a look at making a stitching along the internal hole here. As you can see, since this pattern is at particle distance 20, the pattern has kind of lumpy, rough edge to the internal hole. If I put the pattern down to particle distance 5, it would be a smooth circle. Now you may be thinking that the top stitch, since it's made along the edge of the pattern, would follow the edge of the pattern and be affected by the particle distance and be sort of sharp and edgy as well. Well, let's see if that happens. Since this circle has 4 segments, as you can see when I select them, you could either use the segment tool and create 4 different stitching lines, or if you wanted to make your life easier and create 1 stitching line which you can edit in one go, select the free Topstitch tool, click once, then go around the circle, double click to close the top stitch. Now as you can see, this top stitch is following the internal shape. It's not following the edge of the pattern, which is a good thing because it's nice and round even when the pattern edge is jagged because of the high particle distance. So you don't need to change your particle distance of your patterns in order to get nice smooth stitching. The same thing with this pattern. It's not a perfect circle because of the high particle distance, but when we apply top stitch to it, I'm going to use the free style top stitch tool, double click, you can see that the top stitch follows the ideal round outline of the pattern rather than the jaggedy edge, like it would be if the pattern was at particle distance 5 or lower. Now if we were to edit this top stitch and change the offset to 0, and keeping this pattern at particle distance 20, you can see that the top stitch follows that round outline, but since the particle distance is 20 and it's not perfectly round, we only see part of the stitches on the pattern. If we wanted to see all of them, we would have to reduce the pattern's particle distance to 5. And then since it's more rounded, we see more of the stitches. Now what if we wanted a different stitch type assigned here, a different stitch here, and a different stitch here? Well, there's several ways that you can add new stitch presets. You can either click on one you already have, say copy, which will make a clone of it, which you can then modify slightly, or a lot. But cloning it is especially good if you just want to make small modifications like slight size change or different color. Or you can click this button to add a new preset. It will give you the default top stitch one with the default settings, which you can then change. You can delete a top stitch setting by clicking this delete icon. And another way to create a new top stitch is by clicking on a top stitch line where you want a new top stitch preset assigned, right clicking and say assign to new top stitch, which will create a new top stitch and assign it to that line. Alternatively, instead of right-clicking and selecting Assign to New Top Stitch, you can just click on the top stitch that you want to assign a new top stitch preset to, and then click the Assign button up there in the Top Stitch tab. If you want to change a top stitch in your scene and apply a different preset to it, click on it with the Edit Top Stitch tool, then click on that Assign button on any top stitch preset that you want to apply to it, and it will instantly apply the new preset to it. If you want to select all the different top stitch lines in your scene which have a certain top stitch preset assigned to them, maybe you want to delete them or change them, you can just click on one of them, right click, and say select all with same property. And there you see the second line, which has the same top stitch preset assigned to it, lights up in pink too. And they're both selected. So now I can go ahead and click on a different top stitch to assign that to these top stitch lines, and both update at the same time. If you want to delete a top stitch, simply click on it and either click delete on your keyboard or right click and say delete. Let's take the free Topstitch tool and just make a few short top stitches as an example. And then take the Edit Topstitch tool, and let's say we want to delete all of these little stitches in one go. We don't want to have to click on each and say delete and again delete. Well, you can either hold down Shift and select them all in one go and then delete them, or you can zoom out a bit and then draw out a circle around them with the Edit Topstitch tool and then hit delete, and they'll all be gone at the same time. Or if you didn't want to delete them, you could just select them and then assign a different preset to them. With the Topstitch tool, you can create two top stitches on the same segment or internal line. So for instance, if I wanted a different top stitch here for some reason overlapping, I could do that. And there you see, we have two of them. Now if I wanted to edit one of the top stitches, which are overlapping, you click on it, it gives you two options. Just like with sewing lines, it says, which stitch do you want to edit? Now you can see they have these strange numbers to them. If you want to easily know which stitch is which, besides from the color code, which makes it easy, I recommend that you name your top stitches. So for instance, let's select this red one. To change the name, click on it here. Long top stitch zigzag. And click enter to name it. And then when I click on the two overlapping lines, you can see this one tells me exactly what the red one is and what the blue one is. You can also find your top stitches in your scene on the patterns that they are applied to. So if you don't know which pattern they are applied to, select your pattern. There you can see it's this pattern. It's also a good idea to name your patterns therefore, so you can quickly find them, find everything in your scene. And there you can see long top stitch zigzag. When you click on that, you have some options. We'll get to these in a moment. And here you can also change the property to be one of the other presets, which we have here. So if you wanted to change this long top stitch to be a dotted line, you can change it here. And there we have one long dotted line. Now because they have both the same offset, you can't see the overlapping lines, but if I change it to something else, there you can see the two overlapping ones. Now this thing, that's the really short one. We call it short top stitch. And then you can see it changes here, and it's easy to see what it is. You can select it here, hit delete, and it's gone. Okay, so let's check out some more stitching options. I'm going to take the free stitching tool and stitch along this line. You can stop anywhere along the line. You can create multiple stitches too, like I showed you here. Stop, make another one if you wanted to. You can also extend the stitching lines with the Edit Topstitch tool. So for instance, if you stopped here and then you realized you wanted it to be longer, just grab that end point and drag it all the way to the end. You can also just use the segment stitch tool, click once and then edit it and drag it all the way to the end, or the free stitching tool. So here we've got two stitch lines. Zoom in a bit more. And now let's explore these options here. With the Edit Stitching tool, I'm going to hold down Shift and select the second line. And now when I turn on curved, first of all, let's put this down to 1. When I turn on curved, you can see that the sharp edges here become slightly curved, and here too. And here it's just took away that stitch here as well. If I increase this to 2, you can see it became more rounded. Instead of one big stitch here, we now have 2 shorter stitches to create a rounded edge. Here as well, and here too. And here it's still missing a stitch. If we raise it to 3, it's going to be more rounded. 4. 4, you can see it's rounding it, but it's also bringing it closer to this pointy part. And here there's a bigger distance. So it's not staying parallel anymore. If I take it up to 5, it's cutting into the corner here, and here as well. If we take it up to 6, it's trying to round it and not have that big difference between, sharp. It wants to smooth it all down almost to a flat line eventually. Take it up to 7, it's moving it further, going right through this line here, and 8, and 10. It's cut right through it, and it's no longer conforming to this shape of this zigzag. Now let's take it back down to 1. Turn it off for a moment. And then look at the right angled. And then look at right angled together with curved. So what does right angled do? If we turn it on, you can see it's changed this corner from being a very sharp corner to being slightly rounded here too. See? Sharp pointy corner, slightly rounded shorter corner. Now if we turn on curved as well, with the right angled turned on, you can see that the spacing between these stitches is more even. With it off, it's like a bigger gap between these. This stitch is sort of longer. This one also has a bigger gap, and it's not really flowing that nicely. But with it on, sort of more even and smooth. If we raise this higher to 5, and if we were to turn right angled off, you can see the stitch was cutting through that pointy corner and was no longer keeping that distance from the line, that parallel distance, more or less. But with right angled on, it tries to keep that parallel distance from the sharp tips while smoothing it into a rounded curve. If we raise it even more, to 8, it's still keeping a distance from those curves, it's still trying to conform to that shape, even with it being rounded. Remember, when we turn right angle off, it was cutting right through that shape, no longer keeping to that outline. And here too. It's not having any effect on these parts, but on the parts that stick out, it definitely has an effect. The flip, that will flip the position of the stitch from this side to the other side, like so. And then here again, the right angled is going to have a different effect. And turn the right angled off. Here it's now cutting into these pointy corners. When I turn it on, it gives it a bit of that space. And the same thing happens with any stitching preset and design. Turn on right angled, it tries to keep to that shape. Turn it off, it smooths right through it. Turn off curve, and then just change right angled. You can see here in the tip, it tries to meet up, whereas if it turned off, it just sort of overlaps. Now let's see how to create stitched text. So I'm going to start by taking my segment stitch tool, click once to create the I, click on the L, and then click on the bottom one. And what you can see happens is instead of a nice L, I get these crossing lines here. Same if I do an O, I get a mess of an O. Now that, two things are affecting it, the offset and having multiple stitch lines instead of one. So if I delete that and create a free stitch instead, you can see we have a nice O instead of that mess that we had before. If I go through stitching up all of these, you can see they're all behaving rather differently. The M is huge, the D is tiny, the E is, well, rather defective. So why is this happening? Why isn't it stitching nicely in the same size? It's the offset. Let's go to the Topstitch preset and change the offset from 3.2 to 0. It's going to take a moment. And then you can see all of the stitches, all the text, looks perfect. And the reason for that is now when it's at 0, the stitching is perfectly following these internal shapes. If we were to give it even a tiny offset, such as 0.2, you can see the stitches now. If we zoom in even further, you can see they have a bit of an offset from the letters. And when the offset was much higher, well, these lines, this one from the bottom came up, this one came to the right, and sometimes it decided to go up, sometimes on the inside, and made a mess therefore. So for text stitching, you want to set the offset to 0. And for sharp letters, you definitely do not want to turn on curved. And remember, if for some reason you don't see your stitches in your 2D pattern window, check to see if the I is turned on. Alright, so that's it for top stitching. I hope this tutorial helps you, and see you in the next one.